Have you ever seen someone lose everything in 1 second? Not because they made a mistake, not because they were careless, but because life decided, without warning, to take the one thing they could never get back, their ability to move, to run, to dance, to stand, and replace it with silence, with wheels, with stares from strangers who don't know what to say, with rooms that suddenly feel too big and a body that suddenly feels too small. And if you've never seen that moment happen, if you've never had to sit in that stillness, then let me tell you the story of someone who did, someone who lost the life she knew and found a whole new one because of a dog no one wanted, a dog who ended up doing something no human could. And before we begin, just take a second, breathe in deep, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Because when you hear with this dog, did you want to remember the exact moment you heard it, and maybe, just maybe, you'll believe in something bigger too. And it all started on a warm autumn afternoon in a sleepy town where nothing ever happened, where mailboxes leaned sideways and the trees turned red without asking for permission, and where a woman named Kate, 32 years old, a once fearless trail runner, died in a white farmhouse at the edge of the woods. Just her and her camera, and her dreams of someday photographing the northern lights in Iceland. And she was the kind of woman who filled every space she entered, not with noise, but with light. The kind of person who waved at mailmen and remembered your dog's name, even if she forgot yours. And she didn't need much, just her trails, her solitude, towed in her freedom. Until the day the road turned, the brakes failed, and the world stopped spinning. And in that moment, everything she had been was erased, and everything she would become was a question mark. And when she woke up in the hospital, numb from the waist down, tubes in her arms, voices she didn't recognize, beeping machines keeping time like a cruel metronome. The first thing she said wasn't what happened or am I going to. Be okay, it was. Can I still go outside? Because the thought of never feeling the wind in her hair again, of never running through trees with her camera bouncing on her back was worse than the pain. And the answer they gave her was soft and kind and devastating. She would never walk again, not without a miracle, not with the damage done to her spine. And in that moment, she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because her grief was too big for tears, and grief that sighs doesn't spill out, sinks in, and over the next few weeks, everything changed. The girl who used to run now rolled. The woman who used to laugh now listened. The person who once chased sunsets now stared at ceilings, and friends who once texted daily faded into silence, not out of malice, but out of discomfort, because they didn't know what to say to someone who couldn't move. And slowly, Kate became a ghost in her own life, wheeled into rooms like furniture, pitied by strangers and medical interns who referred to her in the third person. And even though her parents tried, even though the nurses smiled, even though the world kept spinning, Kate did not. And for months she stayed in that in-between place, not sick, not dying, but not living either. Until one day, after being discharged and returning home to an empty house that once felt like a sanctuary and now felt like a prison, she looked out the window and said out loud, "I wish something would change." And that's when it happened. Not a miracle, not a sign from the universe. Just a Craigslist ad, senior dog needs. Last chance foster? With a photo of the saddest pair of eyes she had ever seen, eyes that looked just like hers. Like they had once run through forests too, and now waited for something they couldn't name. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she clicked. The ad called the number, and 3 days later, a dog named Chance was curled up on her living room rug. 13 years old, blind in one eye, ribs showing, fur patchy, tail barely wagging. And the rescue woman who dropped him off said, "He doesn't have long, maybe a few months. Just make him comfortable." And Kate nodded, even though she wasn't sure she could even take care of herself, let alone a dog. But that night, as the wind howled outside and her chair creaked softly in the corner, she heard something, a small whine, not of pain, but of presence. And when she rolled into the living room, there he was, Chance, standing with effort, walking toward her. Not because he needed something, but because he had heard her breathing, and wanted to make sure she wasn't alone. And something about that moment. Something about being seen by another living thing that didn't pity her, that didn't flinch at the sight of her wheels, cracked something open inside Kate. Something that had been buried since the accident, and the next morning she fed him by hand. And the next week she sat outside for the first time in months just to let him sniff the wind. I stared, and the week after that she ordered a leash attachment for her wheelchair, and they began taking short walks around the property. Slow at first, awkward, but filled with something new, routine, rhythm, purpose, and it wasn't easy. Nothing about it was easy, but chance never left her side. Not when she dropped something, not when she cried in the middle of the night, not when her hands shook from frustration, and in time she started laughing again, not loudly, but often, little bubbles of sound that rose up when Chance snored or chased moths or barked at his own reflection. And slowly, the house began to feel like home again, and one day, while brushing his fur, she whispered, "I think we're saving each other," and in his old, tired eyes, she saw something that felt like yes, and she didn't know it yet. But that dog, that forgotten, unwanted, nearly broken dog would not just rescue her from her grief. He would one day do something so extraordinary, so unthinkable, that when people heard the story, they wouldn't believe it. They'd think it was made up. They'd think no animal could be that aware, that fast, that brave. But what they wouldn't know, what they couldn't know, is that when a bond is forged in shared pain, when two souls who have been through the worst find each other, the rules change, the world changes, and what Chance would do for Kate, just a few months later, would leave even the doctors speechless in that story. The story that begins not with her accident, but with the day she whispered, "I'm still here," and Chance wagged his tail like he heard her. It's the one I'm going to tell you, piece by piece, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Have you ever felt a kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of something quiet and alive? Something that sat beside you without making a sound, and still made you feel less alone, because that was the kind of silence Kate began. Waking up to each morning, not the hollow silence of loss she had known after the accident, but the soft, rhythmic breathing of Chance. Curled up at the foot of her bed, paws twitching as if chasing something in a dream, and those mornings became rituals not planned, not forced, but gently woven into the rhythm of their days. And even though Kate still had moments when she stared out the window and wondered what her life might have been like if she had left 5 minutes earlier or later that day, those moments didn't swallow her anymore, because there was always the sound of claws tapping gently across the floor, or a nudge from a wet nose reminding her it was breakfast time, and slowly the days began to change shape. Time began to stretch again, not in dread, but in presence. And she began doing things she never thought she'd do again, like baking. Only now she'd place a stool near the counter so she could reach the flour and feel the texture of the dough beneath her fingers, while Chance sat nearby, watching. Every movement as if it were magic, and sometimes she would talk to him. Not because she expected an answer, but because she needed to hear her own voice again. Chance would tilt his head and blink slowly, the way dogs do when they understand. Something without needing words, and it felt like conversation. It felt like connection. And then came the day she decided to go back to the forest trail behind her property, the one she hadn't dared approach since before the accident. And at first she just wheeled herself to the edge just to see it, just to breathe it in. But Chance pulled forward gently on his leash. Not hard, just enough to say, "Come with me," and she did, slowly. Inch by inch over uneven gravel and fallen leaves, until she reached the clearing where the sun broke through the trees and everything smelled like pine and memory. And she cried, not out of sadness, but because she realized she had made it. She had returned to a place she thought she had lost forever, and Chance sat beside her, unmoving. And they stayed there for almost an hour, just breathing, just being. And after that, the trail became part of their days, and her arms grew stronger, her posture straighter, her voice louder. And sometimes she'd pass joggers or dog walkers who would wave and say, "You're out here every day, huh?" And she'd smile and say, "Every day." And what she didn't tell them, what they didn't need to know, was that every morning, when she thought about staying in bed, about giving up, it was Chance who stood by the door, leash in, his mouth, tail slowly wagging, asking her without asking her to try again. And that mattered. More than therapy, more than medication, more than motivational quotes or well-meaning phone calls from friends who had faded into the background. Because Chance was always there, consistent, silent, present, and soon Kate began writing again, posting small pieces of their journey on a blog she called Still Moving, and readers started finding her, strangers who said, "Your story is helping me walk again, too." And for the first time in years, she felt like her life wasn't just surviving, it was reaching, growing, inspiring. And then came the interview request. A local radio station asking if she'd be willing to come in and share her story. And her first instinct was to say no, to hide, to protect the fragile peace she had built, but Chance sat beside her desk as she read the email. She looked down and whispered, "Do you think I should go?" And he rested his chin on her foot, and that was answer enough. So she said yes. And on the day of the interview, she wore her favorite denim jacket, the one with the frayed collar, and tied a red bandana around Chance's neck, and together they rolled into the studio, and her voice, though shaky at first, grew stronger with every sentence. And when the host asked, "What would you say Chance has done for you?" she looked at him, sitting calmly beside her chair, and said, "He gave me my life back." In the interview aired that night, and emails poured in, messages from veterans, from trauma survivors, from people living with invisible pain, and one woman wrote, "I haven't left my house in months, but tomorrow I'm going to try." And Kate read that message aloud to Chance, who licked her hand and fell asleep at her feet, and that night she realized something she hadn't dared. Believe that maybe her accident hadn't ended her story. Maybe it had just rewritten it, and Chance was helping her tell it, one small moment at a time. But life has a way of testing the very things we begin to rebuild, and it happened so suddenly, so quietly, that neither of them saw it coming. Because for weeks, Chance had been limping slightly on his back leg. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, but enough that Kate noticed, and when she took him to the vet, the words she heard made her stomach twist. "He's old, and his joints are wearing down, but it's more than that. We'll need x-rays. Maybe blood work, maybe more." And she nodded and held back tears, because she had just started to believe in good things again, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. And over the next few days, she watched him closely, how he moved, how he slept, how he ate, and one night, as they walked the edge of the trail, Chance stopped suddenly and stared off into the distance, ears up, body tense, and before Kate could react, a loud mechanical rumble echoed from the tree line, the freight train, one that passed only twice a day, cutting through the forest along a track that curved dangerously close to a section of the trail. And suddenly, Chance barked once, loud, and sharp, and bolted. Not away from the noise, but toward it, leash slipping from Kate's hand as her wheels caught on a root, and she tipped sideways into the grass. And for a terrifying moment, everything went quiet again, not the peaceful quiet of presence, but the awful stillness of panic, of helplessness, of knowing something is wrong and being unable to stop it. And she called out for Chance, but he was gone, swallowed by the trees and the sound of grinding steel in the distance. And she dragged herself upright, hands muddy, heart pounding, and rolled toward the sound, screaming his name, praying he hadn't run onto the tracks, praying this wasn't the moment she lost him. But what she didn't know was that Chance hadn't been chasing the train. He had been chasing something far more dangerous, something Kate hadn't seen, something that would change everything forever. Have you ever had a moment so sharp, so terrifying, that it stretches time into pieces, where seconds feel like hours and everything slows? Not in a movie kind of way, but in the real, awful way your body reacts to danger when your brain screams that something precious is about to be taken, and all you can do is move, even if you're not sure how. And that's exactly what happened to Kate, alone in the woods, wheels jammed in soft earth, watching as the sound of the freight train grew. Louder, not because it was far, but because it was close. Dangerously close, and Chance was gone, vanished into the trees ahead. And her voice cracked as she called his name, her heart slamming against her ribs, because deep down, in the part of her soul that understood things before they could be explained, she knew this wasn't just about a dog chasing a sound. This was about something else. something urgent and unspoken, and she forced her chair forward, gripping the large wheels, pulling through the mud and roots, panting, panicking, calling his name again and again, until she broke through the clearing and saw the tracks. The rails glinting like knives beneath the gray sky. What she saw next nearly stopped her heart, because there, just 20 feet down the tracks, was a small boy, no older than 7, standing directly in the path of the train, frozen, staring. And between him and the engine was Chance, running full speed, faster than Kate had ever seen him move. Old joints forgotten, tail down, focus locked, and she couldn't see everything, not clearly. But what she could see was enough to understand that somehow, in some impossible way, Chance had known, had sensed the boy before she had heard something she didn't, and now he was the only thing between that child and death. And the horn of the train screamed, long and low, and the conductor slammed the brakes, but it was too late. It was always too late with a train. And Kate screamed, her voice raw, as Chance reached the boy, leaped, and knocked him backward into the gravel just as the train thundered through. Wind and noise and heat exploding through the clearing, and for several horrible seconds, she couldn't see anything, dust and sounds swallowing the world, and when it cleared, she wheeled forward, faster than she thought possible, breath shallow, calling both their names, Chance, Chance, please. And then, like a miracle, she saw the boy sitting up, scraped but alive, dazed, looking around. Based, lying still, covered in dust, was Chance, his chest rising and falling, barely. And Kate dropped from her chair, crawling across the earth, tracks ignoring the pain in her arms, ignoring the tears, until she reached him, cradled his head, whispering, you did it, over and over. And Chance blinked slowly, his eyes finding hers, and in that moment, she realized what he had done, what he had known, what he had chosen. He had saved a life that wasn't his to protect, because that's who he was, not just a rescue, not just a companion, but something more, something people write poems about. And the boy, now crying, wrapped his arms around Chance too. And Kate looked up and saw the conductor jumping down from the train, running toward them, followed by a woman screaming the boy's name, his mother, and everything after that happened in pieces. Like fragments of a dream, sirens shouting, arms lifting her back into the chair, paramedics checking the boy, someone saying, the dog's alive, but we need to move. And Kate never let go of Chance's paw, not even as they placed him on a stretcher, not even when they tried to pull her away. And the hospital was bright and cold, and the wait was long. And she sat in the corner of the emergency vet clinic, her legs numb not from paralysis, but from fear. And when the vet finally came out and knelt in front of her, eyes kind, voice calm, saying he has internal bleeding, but we're doing everything we can, she nodded once, then whispered. The vet blinked, nodded, and said, then we owe him everything. And the boy's mother came in too, holding her son's hand, both of them pale, shaking, but alive. She knelt beside Kate and said if it wasn't for him, and couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to, because they all knew what would have happened. And Kate, exhausted, leaned forward and said, I didn't rescue him. He rescued me first, and now he's done it again. And that night, sitting beside Chance in the ICU cage, his body wrapped in blankets, machines beeping gently, Kate told him the story of what he'd just done, even though he already knew, even though he had lived it. And somewhere in the middle of her whispering, his tail thumped, weakly, just once. And she smiled through tears and said, you're still here, and laid her head against the cage and fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, soft and slow. And the next morning, the story was everywhere. Old dog saves child from oncoming train. Headlines read. News anchors told the tale with tears in their eyes, and people across the country sent letters, treats, donations, and one little girl in Florida sent a drawing that said, thank you for being a hero. And Kate taped it beside Chance's cage and whispered, you're more than that. You're family. And for 3 days they waited, hoping, praying, and on the third day, as the vet walked in, smiling, saying he made it through, Kate burst into tears. The kind that come from the deepest place, the kind you don't realize you've been holding for years. And that afternoon, she wheeled him out into the sun, wrapped in blankets, and said, "We made it," and in his tired eyes, "Oh." She saw a truth that would carry her through the rest of her life, that love when it's real. Oh. When it's quiet and steady and asks for nothing in return is the most powerful thing on earth, and sometimes it comes with fur and 4 legs and the kind of loyalty that changes everything. Have you ever looked at someone you love while they slept and realized that just their breathing was enough to make the world feel safe again? That the rise and fall of their chest meant something deep and unshakable, like the promise that everything might just be okay. And that's how Kate felt every single morning for the first month after the accident on the tracks. Waking in her chair, curled up beside Chance's recovery bed, the sterile white walls of the veterinary ICU softened by drawings from children, flowers from strangers, and thank you cards pinned up by nurses who called him our miracle dog. And each morning she would whisper, "Are you still with me?" And each morning he would blink or sigh or thump his tail against the mattress in that slow, tired way that told her he was still fighting, still staying, still choosing to be here. And the vet techs, who had seen 100 dogs come and go, started saying they'd never seen anything like it, the way Chance responded only to her voice. The way his vitals changed when she rolled into the room, the way he refused to eat unless she was the one feeding him by hand. Boiled chicken, sweet potatoes, soft words, and there were days when it looked bad, days when his breathing became shallow or his pain spiked. Kate would hold his paw and say, "You've done enough. You don't have to stay for me," and each time he'd press his nose into her hand like he was saying, "Not yet," and outside the clinic. The world had taken their story and made it into something bigger, something brighter, because the video from the train, captured accidentally by a hiker on his phone, had gone viral. Not just locally, but across the country, and news stations played it on repeat. Anchors teared up, and millions watched as Chance pushed a boy to safety, then lay still, and the world reacted the only way it could, with awe, with love, with action, and suddenly the small town Kate had always called home became a destination not for tourists, but for people looking for hope, looking for something real, and letters flooded in, not emails, not tweets, but handwritten letters from grandmothers and kids, and veterans and parents who said things like, "Your dog reminded me what love looks like. And because of Chance, I took my first walk outside today. And I believe in something again." And Kate read every one of them, loud to Chance, every single day. And the mayor called and asked if they could do a ceremony, something simple, something respectful. And Kate said yes, as long as Chance was well enough. And 3 weeks later, wrapped in a red fleece blanket, he was wheeled out onto the small stage in front of the town library, surrounded by hundreds of people holding signs that said, "Thank you, Chance, and you're our hero." And when Kate lifted the microphone, she paused, looked out over the sea of faces, then down at her dog and said, "I was supposed to die alone in my house after my accident, quietly forgotten, but instead I got to live because of him, because someone believed I was worth staying for." And the crowd stood in complete silence as she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "And I'm staying for you too," and after the ceremony. When the local paper ran the headline, "The Dog Who Waited and Acted," people came to her porch and left gifts, not for her, but for Chance. A new collar with gold stitching, hand-sewn blankets, toys he no longer had the energy to chase, but still liked to smell. And slowly, as the weeks passed, he began walking. Again, stiff at first, slow, but determined, his eyes bright, his tail wagging when he saw familiar faces. And Kate began pushing herself too, returning to her trails, this time with Chance beside her in a custom harness that let them move together. Stronger now, braver, not just surviving, but living. And one morning, months later, she received an email from a rehabilitation center across the country, asking if she and Chance would be willing to speak to patients people struggling with recovery, with loss, with paralysis, and she said yes. Not because she thought she had answers, but because she finally understood that showing up, that simply staying was sometimes more powerful than anything else, and so they traveled. A woman in a chair and a dog with a limp, rolling into rooms where hope had gone quiet, and lit something again just by being there. And sometimes people didn't even speak. They just reached down and touched Chance's fur and cried. And Kate would sit beside them and say, "He found me when I couldn't find myself." And somehow that was enough. And on the 1-year anniversary of the rescue, the little boy Chance saved came to visit, older now, braver, holding a picture he had drawn in crayon, a train, a stick-figured dog, and a giant heart. And when he gave it to Kate, he whispered, "I want to be brave like him." And she nodded and said, "You already are." And that night, after everyone had left, she and Chance sat on the porch, the sky turning orange, wind soft, and she looked over and said, "Can you believe what we've become?" And he sighed, curled up beside her, and for the first time since the accident, since her life had been torn apart and rebuilt by love, she leaned back, closed her eyes, and felt peace. Not the kind that forgets what happened, but the kind that accepts it, honors it, and keeps going anyway. Because healing doesn't mean pretending the pain didn't happen. It means finding a way to live with it. And with Chance beside her, she was doing exactly that. One moment at a time. One breath, one paw print, one story. Have you ever watched someone grow old and realize that every scar on their body, every wrinkle near their eyes, every slow breath they take, is not a sign of weakness, but a record of love they gave, and pain they carried, and moments they stayed? When others walked away, because that's how Kate felt every time she looked at Chance in those final years, not with sadness, but with reverence, because here was a soul who had already done more than most hearts ever get the chance to do. And every morning they had together was a gift, a quiet echo of a life they built from brokenness. And they never stopped living fully, not when the pain came back in his legs, not when her shoulders ached from years of wheeling herself up steep paths, not even when the seasons turned and the world kept changing. Because they had a rhythm now, a silent language, a life of pauses and purpose. And their story, once just a local headline, had become something so much bigger. Because schools invited them to speak about courage, shelters launched adoption, drives in Chance's name. And parents told their children the bedtime story of the dog who saved the boy, who saved the woman, who saved himself. And sometimes, Kate would sit in front of a group of children and ask, "What do you think, love?" Looks like. And they would raise their hands and say things like hugs or kisses or chocolate. She would smile and say, "Those are all true, but love also looks like staying, even when it's hard." Aid. And she'd look down at Chance sleeping beside her with his graying muzzle resting on her foot. And she'd add, "Sometimes love has fur." And they'd all giggle, and sometimes cry. And it was beautiful. All of it. Even the aching parts. Because what Chance had taught her wasn't just how to walk again, it was how to be still and whole and unafraid of silence, how to see herself not as broken, but as reassembled, different, but just as strong. And as the years passed, she began writing their story for real, not just blogs or speeches, but a book. Long, quiet, truthful, and it took her 3 years to finish, because she didn't want to rush the ending, because she didn't know yet what the ending would be. But one night, after reading the last chapter aloud to Chance on the porch, beneath a sky thick with stars, she closed the laptop and whispered, "It's ready." And he opened one eye and let out a small sigh. She knew that was his way of saying, "I'm proud of you." And not long after that, the day she had always known would come finally came, quiet and kind, the way he would have wanted. It, with the sun rising through the window, and her voice in his ears, and her hand resting over his heart. And when his last breath came, she didn't cry, not right away, because it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the soft closing of a chapter in a story that would keep being read by people who needed it. And she buried him beneath the willow tree out back, the one they used to sit under after long walks, with a small wooden marker that simply read, "Thank you for staying," and every year after. She planted sunflowers there, and kids from the town would come and leave drawings. And sometimes strangers, People who had read the book or seen the video or just heard a whisper of the story would visit and sit and cry and write their own goodbyes in a notebook Kate left on the bench. And it became a place not of sadness, but of stillness, a place where people remembered that love isn't loud, that sometimes it walks beside you and doesn't ask for anything but your presence. And Kate kept going, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because chance had shown her how. And one spring morning, she adopted another dog, not to replace him, because you can't replace a soul like that, but to continue the rhythm they'd created, to pass it on, and she named him Echo, because that's what love does. It echoes. And he was different, younger, clumsier, louder. But when she wheeled to the porch that evening and whispered, "Let's go," Echo came running. And they walked the same path Chance once did. And she felt it again, the quiet, the warmth, the presence. And she looked up at the sky and said, "We're still, here and in the distance." The wind moved through the trees, and it sounded a little like laughter, a little like goodbye. And she smiled, knowing that some stories never end. They just change form, move forward, keep breathing. And so if you've made it to the end of this story, if you're still here with us, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because I want you to remember this moment. The moment you heard about a woman who couldn't walk, a dog who wouldn't leave, and how together they changed everything. And maybe tonight, when you look at your own dog, or sit quietly on your couch, or walk through a field with nothing but your thoughts, you'll remember that love is not what we say, it's what we do, and sometimes it's what we stay for.